Okay, so I want to start off with an exercise here for you all, 3 questions for you to think about. The first is, I want you all to think of experiences in your life where you lost track of time. These could be solo or group activities, for example, reading, writing, public speaking, teaching, playing a sport or musical instrument, being interviewed, and so on. Then of whatever experience or experiences you think then, were any of them challenging in the sense that your skills were stretched to meet some task? Think about which skills were stretched there. And then finally, what was the experience and what was the main skill that was stretched? When you're ready, please type that experience and the skill in the chat, and I will type mine as well. Mine was incidentally being interviewed by Katie Granville Chapman at Wellington College. I completely lost track of time doing that, and the skill was thinking on my feet. And actually, if anyone's interested, I'll share a link to that interview here. It was a lot of fun doing that. Writing, Jason. Deep conversation, Noemi. Writing, public speaking, Kenny. Painting, Daniel, awesome. Writing about flourishing, Matt, of course. Well, you must spend a hell of a lot of time in flow then. Awesome. Okay, so please keep entering these. I'm going to move on as you're entering them. We're going to return to these later in breakout discussions. There's some amazing examples of 4 hours with my newborn grandson in the morning, Jim. Finishing your final defense presentation about flourishing this week, Wendy. Wow, okay, this is awesome. And Glenn, scuba diving, and of course, we'll be returning to that later in some detail. Well, chances are, of these experiences you've entered there, that you experienced flow, which we'll now turn to look at, and we'll return to these experiences in the breakouts later. So what is flow? Flow is the psychological state of optimal experience and performance, where we're completely concentrated on a challenging but doable activity such that we must stretch our skills to their limits to meet it. So you experience flow, for example, when you're in the zone playing sports, so engrossed by a challenging book you can't put it down, playing a solo at the edge of your ability on a musical instrument, trying to solve a difficult problem, and so on. And the concept was coined by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in the 70s. And the previous slide I titled Finding Flow, because that's the title of the abridged version of that book you see on your screen. Some examples of flow. Here we have Alex Honnold scaling El Capitan, free climbing in Yosemite. We see Gary Kasparov, chess player, when he amazingly lost a match against the computer Deep Blue in 97. And those are, of course, we've got a chess master here and, someone who's able to do something absolutely extraordinary at the top. But note that flow experiences don't need to be of this extraordinary kind. Reading and writing are extremely common experiences. Here we have bottom right, Simone de Beauvoir, writing and reading. I'm sure she got into flow all the time. And as Matt said in the chat, then he often gets to flow when writing about flourishing. Now, key to getting into flow is getting the right balance between challenge and skills. That is to say, pushing your skills to their limit in response to some challenge, making an activity challenging but doable. And here's an illustration that Csikszentmihalyi includes in his book Flow. And he writes, flow tends to occur when a person's skills are fully involved in overcoming a challenge that is just about manageable. Just to explain this diagram, imagine A1 represents some agent, some person at 4 different stages of their progression through some skills. Let's imagine that this is a basketball player, for example. And let's imagine A1 is playing in the B team in basketball, and they want to get into the A team. They try out for the A team, but they're not quite good enough yet. And they're really anxious, when they're playing, and they mess up a lot of shots, a lot of dribbles and so on, because they're not fully concentrated because of their anxiety. They're then in A3 outside the flow channel, and their heightened anxiety prevents them from performing at their best. They then return to the B team. So they don't make the A team. They keep playing there for a few months, keep practicing hard. Their skills increase, and they're much better than their peers in the B team. They get bored. They're not really stretching themselves in their matches. They enter A2, and they're really not pushing themselves to their limit. Then let's imagine a few months later that player A1 tries out for the A team again, and they've now trained themselves sufficiently such they're good enough to get into the A team. They are pushing their skills to their limit, but they're able to meet those challenges. They're then in the flow channel at the position of A4. And Csikszentmihalyi argued that this was key to getting into flow. Now, Csikszentmihalyi focused on flow in individuals, but Keith Sawyer, a psychologist and a jazz musician, and that's going to be relevant in a moment, also identified what he called the concept of group flow, the shared flow experience, as described in his 2007 book, Group Genius. So, for example, consider a jazz band. Now, Sawyer was a jazz musician, and this inspired him to kind of develop this idea of a group flow state. So here you have, for example, the Miles Davis Septet, all pushing their skills, their limits in response to this demanding activity, playing live improvised jazz collectively in this state of being in flow. You also have sports players being in the zone, a live improv group having to create a funny comedy sketch live on the spot, or a team trying to solve a difficult problem. For example, Alan Turing and his colleagues here depicted at Bletchley Park trying to crack the Enigma code. Now, researchers identified 22 flow triggers, 12 individual and 10 group, and there may well be more that are identified in the future. And these are factors that significantly facilitate flow. So researchers trace these individual ones onto these experiences here. In the case of Alex Honnold, you see that all of those would be there to a deep level. I mean, especially risk. To a lesser degree, risk with Garry Kasparov. He's, his career, his kind of reputation, he feels, might be standing on the line. He might lose to a computer here, and he's, arguably at the time was arguably the world's greatest chess player. And other factors here, such as the deep embodiment of the experience, such as you're one with the experience, the novelty of doing new things, and of course the challenge skills ratio. In the group triggers, the first two are shared. The third and fourth are shared versions of the individual ones, shared risk, shared goals. And then we have some new ones. For example, yes and is a principle taken from improv, the idea of the discussion being constructive. So you build upon what each other say. So a member of the live improv group, if they have a sketch where they say, I walked up to a bar and I ordered a fountain pen. Right now, the worst thing they could do in the improv there would be to shut down the discussion and be like, well, that's odd. Why would you do that in a bar? Rather than, that's interesting. Did you ask for a piece of paper with the pen? And take it somewhere, right? Yes, and rather than no, but. Close listening, blending egos would be, for example, in the jazz band there, if the tabla player or the percussionist just went off on one while Miles Davis is trying to solo it and didn't really calm down, it's not going to sound very good. They've got to support the soloist. They've got to blend their egos for a collective performance of the whole. And the rest, you see, they're pretty self-explanatory. Note here that chess and tennis are games. Climbing and live music can be gamified, and live improv shares many characteristics with games. They're playing in various respects, and gamification has been identified as an excellent way to trigger flow because it involves so many flow triggers. And I'll share a link with you in the chat here, actually, to an article by a friend of mine, Blair Murray Casati, on gamification in learning and how that can bring about flow in educational contexts. Now, one good way to facilitate flow then would be to try to ensure as many of these triggers as possible are present as deeply as possible in some experience where you want to get into flow. So in the individual case, trying to identify ways that you could bring about those triggers and things you're doing, for example, by setting yourself clear goals or making the experience one where you get immediate feedback. And note that feedback doesn't need to come from someone else. It could come from yourself. So for example, in the experience of chess, there's feedback if Garry Kasparov loses a piece, he's got feedback, well, that was a very good move to make, and so on. You can then build on that. You can get feedback in various ways. And in the group case, looking for ways that you can bring about those kinds of triggers. And in the most recent meeting, you saw one example of how we can try to facilitate group triggers in teaching and learning, where I described a project, an intervention I did last year on trying to facilitate group flow in the teaching of philosophy. And if anyone wants to know any more about that, please just send me a message in the chat and I'll send you an article I'm currently writing on that. So why is flow important? Well, evidence suggests that it significantly enhances happiness, well-being, learning, performance, and creativity. It can lead to up to 500% more productivity and creativity, and enables us to learn 200 to 500% faster. And Csikszentmihalyi argued that we're at our most creative, productive, and happy when we're in flow. So flow is, excellent for productivity and efficiency, but note that Csikszentmihalyi's book was really also about happiness, and it's subtitled in more recent versions the classic work on how to achieve happiness. And he thought that the pathway towards true happiness was to try and bring about lots of flow in your life. I've referred there to an article by our long-standing member Nick Holton on this. That was for a blog I edited for a few years ago. I worked at Eton College. I've just shared a link to that there if you want to follow it up. It's an excellent article by Nick. On happiness, Csikszentmihalyi thought there was a direct connection between the flow channel and happiness. He writes this in Flow: in all activities, enjoyment comes at a very specific point, whenever the opportunities for action perceived by the individual are equal to his or her capabilities. Enjoyment appears at the boundary between boredom and anxiety, when the challenges are just balanced with the person's capacity to act. And he writes this on the corresponding page to that diagram of the flow channel there. Now, he may go too far here. All activities, enjoyment comes at this point, but the point is here that he argues, referring to a lot of research he did on flow in individuals, that this kind of experience, this kind of pushing your skills to their limits in response to challenges, can have significant benefits for your long-term happiness. It also, of course, supports the fulfillment of potential, which is central to most, if not all, accounts of human flourishing, particularly Aristotelian accounts and positive psychology, and also influential models in psychology that you could use as guides for certain areas of research and flourishing, such as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. To achieve self-actualization, you need to fulfill your potential. And this connection with flow and happiness and fulfillment of potential brings us on to the role of flow in human flourishing. Now, flow is one of the 5 domains constitutive of flourishing, defined as psychological well-being in positive psychology, defined as the scientific study of the conditions and processes that lead to human flourishing on multiple levels, including the biological, personal, relational, institutional, cultural, and global dimensions of life. Its express goal is to increase flourishing. And the so-called PERMA theory of well-being, an acronym made up of those letters on the left there, has 5 domains that constitute psychological well-being, the second of which is engagement, which means flow. That's why at the start of this call, when Christine put engaged as her one-word check-in, I said that was particularly pertinent here, because engagement in positive psychology means flow. Positive psychology also holds that to flourish, you need to identify your signature character strengths and utilize those as much as you can in your lives. And that's connected with getting into flow more, because research has found that people are more likely to experience flow when they employ their top character strengths. Some studies have even indicated that individuals who tried to use their strengths in new ways each day for a week were happier and less depressed after 6 months. As Martin Seligman writes in his book Flourish, you need to deploy your highest strengths and talents to meet the world in flow. Now, each of those 5 domains of PERMA is held by positive psychology to be autotelic, that is to say, an end in itself, something we pursue for its own sake. And Csikszentmihalyi's interest in flow is primarily with autotelic experiences and people with what he described as autotelic personalities. So he was really interested in what kind of the work lives and the way that people worked and lived, people who did things purely for the sake of just doing them with no further goal, particularly creative individuals, artists, writers, and so on. And through various studies on people like this, he found that they would describe their experiences as ones where the work and what they were doing was kind of just flowing out of them. They would often use this word flow to describe it. The creativity was just pouring out of me, flowing out of me. I was just one with the experience. And he originally even wanted to entitle flow the autotelic personality, but his publishers didn't think it'd be very juicy as a title, so they went with flow instead. Now, it's interesting, this idea of autotelic domains and theories of flourishing, because all the major theories of flourishing employ the methodology of identifying the domain, singular, for example, in the case of Aristotle, eudaimonia is what flourishing is. It's this single thing we aim for, the thing that we pursue for its own sake, the one autotelic domain, or several domains we pursue as ends in themselves. This is kind of a methodological unity you see across all theories of flourishing. Find the domain or the domains we pursue in life that are ends in themselves, and then find ways we can enhance in our lives as a means of flourishing. You see that in both positive psychology and in the human flourishing program at Harvard. And you have 5 domains in each, which differ in some ways, but there's various similarities across both. So, for example, in Tyler's paper on where he describes the human flourishing program's account of flourishing, that his 2017 paper on the promotion of flourishing, which I'll share in the chat with you here. He describes these 5 domains as ones that are generally viewed as ends in themselves and are nearly universally desired. And he writes that these 2 criteria may be useful guides and decisions concerning the domains that should be included to assess flourishing. And he writes that arguably at least part of what we mean by flourishing would involve all of those domains on the right. He doesn't argue, though, that flourishing is reducible those domains on the right. They don't exhaust what flourishing is, but they do constitute features of what any plausible account of flourishing should include. So there's slight differences across these, but various shared similarities, which I've illustrated on this next slide here. So if we look at both those accounts, positive psychology and the Human Flourishing Program, we can extract 8 domains of well-being. In the case of positive psychology, it's purely psychological well-being. In the case of the Human Flourishing Program, it's well-being more broadly, complete human well-being, psychological, physical, and otherwise. And we can get all these domains, and I've indicated in parentheses here where the domain is one that's in just one of those accounts or is shared. So 1, 2, 3, 7, and 8 are shared across both theories with some qualifications. So for example, number 7 in positive psychology, that's the development of character strengths. With the Human Flourishing Program, it's the development of character virtues. And 8, fulfillment of potential, and in the sense of life satisfaction. I think you see both of those emerge across both theories. Health is in the Human Flourishing Program's account, but not in positive psychologies. There are some late developments of PERMA that make PERMA plus H, but not in the kind of the one identified with Seligman's work, which is kind of the seminal work on positive psychology. And also positive psychology has flow and accomplishment as kind of primary domains in its account. Now, people often ask me, as I'm sure they often ask many of you, what is the kind of the best way to enhance your flourishing? How can we truly flourish? What's the method for doing this? What's the kind of the $1 million question? How do I do this right now? And of course, there isn't a simple answer to that. But one answer I often give is, well, a pretty good method you could employ for trying to enhance your own and others' flourishing as much as possible would be to enhance all of these domains in your life as much as possible and the lives of others, as long as none of them conflict with the others. So, for example, you pursue accomplishment, but not at the expense of cultivating good, close social relationships. You make sure your health is as good as possible, but you're not spending hours and hours all day on it, such that it's to the detriment if you able to spend sufficient time on cultivating your relationships, or spending enough time to, make accomplishments and so on, or fulfill your potential, and so on and so forth, right? That's, a pretty good method, I think, because all of these domains have emerged across much research by in various, accounts of well-being, summarized, for example, in Tyler's article I shared earlier, and in positive psychology. And of course, Tyler refers to the research in positive psychology in that article. Right, what I'd like to do now is I've mentioned various experiences of flow, and we have on our call today a friend of mine, Glenn Wagner, CEO of the Finnish Strong Group. He's an entrepreneur, leadership coach, and strategist for growing companies. He's also an avid diver, passionate about ocean health and sharks, and he's a client of mine that I coach at the Flow Research Collective, an organization that Michael Mannino, who's going to be giving a talk later in this call, and myself work for, where we coach people in how to get more flow in their lives. And this is Glenn diving 30 feet underwater with a 17-foot pregnant tiger shark this summer. And I'm just going to show you an 8-second video of him doing this, just to show you how intense this experience really was, and illustrate this as a paradigmatic example of getting into flow. So, Glenn, you're on the call here. Let me find you. Where are you, Glenn? There you are. I'm just spotlight Glenn here. There we go. Glenn, tell us, what was that experience like?
It was glorious. I've been diving since 1974. That's kind of a dream trip. It's probably not for everybody, but tens of thousands of people have been diving in that spot. It's called Tiger Beach. It's off of Grand Bahama Island. I was there in February with a good friend of mine. We made 21 dives, about 18 hours underwater, and never once with less than about 30 or 40 sharks. And that included tiger sharks, bull sharks, lemon sharks, reef sharks, nurse sharks. And one day it included a great hammerhead. The shark that you saw was circling around and circling around. And I'm an underwater photographer, so the flow triggers for me were almost all of them: curiosity, autonomy, It requires complete concentration. Some would say there's risk involved. Novelty,
Right, so yeah,
complexity.
I've pulled these up here. So you would say, so certainly risk. So this is a great example, and that's one of the reasons I invited Glenn to speak about this today. This is a great example of employing the flow triggers here to effectively get into flow. So you'd say, Glenn, that all of those are present for you during that experience?
I think all of them, absolutely. It was one of the best flow experiences. I wouldn't have called it a flow experience at that time, but I hadn't been through Zero to Dangerous. Once I went through Zero to Dangerous, I went, wow, that's flow. So that was it.
Right. Those of you listening, Zero to Dangerous is one of the coaching programs that Glenn is on right now. So yeah, this is an example of how you can employ, various those flow triggers to great effect to get into a deep flow experience. But as I said earlier, you don't have to swim with man-eating sharks to necessarily get into flow or scale El Capitan. You can also get into it reading, writing, and so on. Thank you very much, Glenn. Right, I want us to go into breakout rooms for a few minutes now and discuss the following things. So 3 questions, and I'll put these in the chat. First question, in which activity do you most experience flow? And that might be clear from the start of this call when you put that in the chat. Second, why do you think you experience flow in that activity? So consider the flow triggers and whether you see that activity as an end in itself, something you do for no other reason. And third, how could you facilitate flow more in your area of work? I will paste those 3 questions into the chat right now. Just think about those for 1 sec while I do so. And I'll also paste the flow triggers into the chat so you have them in case you want to refer back to them in your discussion. 1 second. There we go. And not long on this, 4 minutes, and then we're going to have some group shares at the end, and then we're going to go into Michael Mannino's talk. I'll put you in groups of 4.
John, I see that Nicoletta has a hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to come to questions in a bit, but not right now, because I want to make sure we allocate enough time for Michael's talk first. Right, there are 16.
Just to be sure, it was for Glenn. I hope she's not leaving the meeting.
Oh, cool.
No?
Glenn will be around.
No,
Don't worry. All right, I think 16 rooms, 54 people. We have 4 per room, 10. Yeah, that's a little bit less than that. Let's go 14 rooms. All right. See you in a moment. All right, everyone, welcome back. Hope you had some awesome breakout discussions then. So what I would love to hear now is if you could just share in the chat here, please, your answer to, 1 moment. Let me just go back. There we go. I would love to hear 2 things in the chat. Number 1, what was your top flow experience? And number 2, what is one way you could facilitate flow more in your area of work? I'll put those in the chat here. Your top flow experience and one way, let's just call it one way, you can facilitate flow more in your area of work. When you're out in nature, Noemi, movement improvisation, Joel, outdoor meetings, Noemi, okay, cool. Love the idea of that. Backpacking, Jason, teaching, Nectaria. Anything involving some kind of improv, Kenny, awesome. Let go of results, right? There's going to be loads of awesome responses in here. Please keep posting them, and we might have time to kind of revisit some of these at the end of the call. But now we're going to move on to the second part of this call. So please keep posting those, because I'd love to hear from these, and I'd love to come back to you on some of your comments. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our guest speakers in today's call, Dr. Michael Mannino and Steven Kotler. Michael Mannino is Chief Science Officer at the Flow Research Collective. He and I are colleagues there. It's a coaching organization that aims to bring flow as much as possible to people's lives. Glenn is one of our clients there. And Steven Kotler is the founder of the Flow Research Collective and also New York Times bestselling author of, I believe, 15 or maybe even 16 books now. Most recent of which in the context of flow is The Art of Impossible on Peak Performance. And Michael's going to talk to you today about an article that he and Steven have recently co-authored with a couple of other academics as well on flow in the context of trauma. So Michael, I'll make you a co-host here, and great. Feel free to go ahead and share your screen, and I'll share some links on Michael and his work, and Steven and his work in the chat as well.
Great, thanks, John. So yeah, I will highlight that the Flow Research Collective, we are a training organization, but we are also a research organization as well, doing some phenomenal, very interesting projects on some of the neurobiology and physiology and psychology of flow as well. John, I will say that you gave me, well, 10:32, so now 20 minutes to distill down a paper that's about 90 pages long. So if the challenge exceeds my skill set, I'm going to blame you on this one. So I'm going to do my best here. Let me share my screen for y'all. And there we go. Can you see it? Right?
All good, yeah.
Cool. Let me put you guys on the screen here so I can see everybody. There we go. So I think a perfect segue into this short talk is that the last 10 or 15 years or so have seen a great effort from modern neuroscience to find out what's happening in the brain during flow states. We have found that flow is something that exists and has structural and functional changes in the brain. So I'm a neuroscientist, so this paper is going to be from a neuroscientific perspective. So we've reduced it down from a psychological phenomenon to an actual neurobiological phenomenon to show that flow is actually something that's happening in the brain. And that has just changed how we train flow, how we research flow. But not many people, or I should say no one up to now, or about 3 years ago, Steven started thinking about not what happens when we put people in scanners and look at what happens in their brains during flow state, but how the brain actually gets to the flow state. How does it find the flow state? And so we named our paper The First Few Seconds of Flow, a comprehensive proposal for the neurobiology and neurodynamics of state onset. My actually PhD advisor, Scott Kelso, is on this paper. He's one of the fathers of social neuroscience and coordination dynamics. And then a prominent flow researcher, neuroscientist, Richard Huskey, is also on this paper too. He uses fMRI and EEG work to study flow as well. And so Steven has actually thought, well, maybe looking at trauma as well as the psychedelic state can actually help give insight into how the brain makes its way to the flow state and transitions into flow state. So that's how this sort of idea came about. We're quite optimistic about the publication of this paper very soon. It's like I said, it's a large paper, it's huge manuscript, and I'm going to try and distill it down here in the next 15 minutes. So bear with me. I'm going to sort of rapid fire this here, and then I'm going to try and leave time for questions and balancing out just to give you an idea to distill the core concepts of the paper here. So let's first think about a thought experiment. Consider a hypothetical situation, very, very, very related to, Glenn, I think your experience with the shark. So this is very interesting. And this is the thought experiment we're using as a foundation in our paper. So imagine a motorcyclist, a highly skilled motorcyclist, experienced motorcyclist heading down the freeway. A car veers into his lane, or there's an accident, as you'll see in this video. The motorcyclist has to swerve, counter swerve, and survive. And you can imagine two possible outcomes. There's other outcomes, but you can imagine two. On the one hand, the motorcyclist heads down the highway and was like, oh my God, what the heck just happened to me? There's a sense of overwhelm, a sense of anxiety, maybe even a stressful sort of event, like I'm still alive. That's really crazy. That could maybe lead to trauma or PTSD down the road, pun intended. Or another outcome, the motorcyclist knows exactly what to do, heads into it, swerves perfectly, all of the flow triggers are present, heads down the road, survives. It's maybe even a rewarding experience. Remember, it's Autotelic. The motorcyclist is very skilled. It's doing this. This is what he loves to do. And maybe it leads to flow. So the brain drops into flow. So the question here is, what drives the experience or the neurobiology to lead to flow on the one hand, or the possibility of PTSD and trauma on the other hand? So I'm going to play for you this video now to give you a really good visual of what we're talking about here. Here's the slow-mo. Pretty incredible. And Glenn, I will say, oops, let me go to my next slide here. Hold on. Okay. Glenn, I will say that, and you were talking, John, you were talking about this experience too. It was a flowy experience, but there's a possibility that it could have went to possibly this other outcome that we're talking about, right? A traumatic experience. And we've all had situations like this. Any action sport athlete has had situations like this. It's a high stakes scenario. And we're using this as a motivation to drive some of these questions that we're asking. How does the brain, oops, let me move my thing here. How does the brain transition into a flow state? How does that transition into flow precisely unfold in time, neurobiologically in the brain? What's happening there? We're also asking, what are the neurodynamical processes that mark this transition? And in this sense, we're thinking about flow in a broader context, a broader theoretical framework of other cognitive states and other altered states of consciousness, like I said, trauma and the psychedelic state. And I'll explain why we're talking about that in a second. Another question that's motivating this research is, can this yield any insight into a broader science of consciousness? Particularly, can we think about the link between what happens in the brain during the transition into a flow state and our experience of it? So this is a more of a neurophenomenological approach. Okay, so the goals and the purpose of this paper is really, it's 5 or 6-fold, but it's to propose a novel empirical and theoretical framework for for the dynamics of flow and how the brain transitions into a flow state. Let me actually move this here so I can see this. There. And in doing so, we want to be able to generate testable hypotheses that we can look at empirically later on, possibly create a model or a computational model that can actually help describe and explain how the brain transitions into a flow state. And as I said, get some insight into the neurophenomenology of flow, trauma, and the psychedelic state, and just the science of consciousness in general. So we want to understand flow in a broader theoretical framework. And I'll come back to the motorcyclist experiment hypothetical situation in just a second. But the idea here is, number one, why does the brain either go into a flow state or a traumatic state, drop into a flow, or possibility of PTSD in the future? And two, can flow be used to actually alleviate PTSD? And there's some very interesting evidence on that. So we've considered this hypothetical situation, and like I said, I'll return to it in a second. But we've also decided to extend this model to include the psychedelic state. And we're doing so for 2 reasons. One, the psychedelic state actually now has overwhelming evidence that it can very much help things like depression, PTSD, alcoholism, and I'll explain the best model of what happens in the brain under a psychedelics and why that's very useful for these things. There's a lot of new psychotherapeutic approaches. And 2, it's a lot easier to put people in scanners under psychedelics and see what happens in their brain, right? We can't do that so much in flow. So there's massive amounts of brain imaging data about what happens in the brain under psychedelics, and we've come up with a really interesting framework and model for how that works. But there are a lot of similarities, but also a lot of distinctions between psychedelics and flow. Similarly, or similarity-wise, we lose our sense of self. There's an altered perception of self, altered perception of time, a merger of action and awareness, and so on. But there are points of departure as well, right? Flow, as John rightly talked about, you're engaged in a task, right? You're bringing a certain skill set to that task. You have clear goals. There's immediate feedback. So there are very large points of departure between the psychedelic state and flow. And we want to motivate the science behind psychedelics to infer what might be happening in the brain during the flow state and how the brain finds that flow state. Carl Friston in the UK, for example, there's a lot of legal matters about testing and researching of psychedelics now. He recently made a huge push for the UK and the government to make it easier to test in the lab and in academic environments psychedelics. Same thing is happening here in the States as well. But you can imagine the motorcyclists going down the highway under psilocybin. It's not going to be the same thing. You're probably not going to get the same outcome, right? So to have a dramatic example, or Glenn, you probably wouldn't go swimming with sharks after taking shrooms, right? So back to the question here of the motorcyclist. What precise alterations in brain function and neurodynamics distinguish these 2 possible outcomes that we've talked about, either the transition into flow or traumatic stress? By the way, John, can you keep an eye on my time? Because I don't see a clock anywhere. I don't have my phone.
Absolutely. It's 18 minutes to the hour. It's fine.
Appreciate it. Okay. So we're going to take you through a time-coded sequence here of events in the brain through this example that we think correlate with the onset of flow and how the brain finds and transitions into a flow state. I'll take you through each of these rather quickly to try and describe what's happening in the brain here. So let me move this down here. So pre-flow, pre-trauma, the motorcyclist is heading down the highway, not yet in flow or trauma, but focused. There is an activation of networks in the brain that are involved in salience and paying attention and knowing what to do and selecting proper motor actions, for example. The accident happens. The car veers over, the accident happens. There's an error signaling in the brain. And this just means the brain gets information, new information that's unexpected or surprising or frightening, perhaps. That's maybe a threat in this example. T plus 2, T plus 3, T plus 4. Selective attention. The brain needs to filter everything else out. It needs to ignore everything. And by the way, if you looked very closely on that video, you could see the motorcyclist sort of look to make sure everything was clear and he had room to swerve around the accident. Amazingly skilled, amazingly brilliant. So possibly a flow state. T plus 3, task engagement versus disengagement. And here we have different neurotransmitter systems that we propose are involved in the brain's transition to flow state. Other people have also actually proposed this in the literature too, but here we're outlining a specific mechanism by which this happens. The locus coeruleus, an area in the brain that produces norepinephrine. That's the birthplace of norepinephrine and norepinephrine pathways in the brain. It's a focusing chemical. It's also involved in mood and reward, by the way. Dopamine, the endocannabinoid system. All of these systems we're proposing happen at the onset of flow. The brain detects the threat, assesses the threat, and then starts to process the threat. And the amygdala and other areas are involved in this processing. In fact, all of the information that comes into the conscious awareness in our brain passes pretty much through the amygdala as one of the first structures in order to be able to assess whether the stimulus is a threat or not. T plus 6, and I'm going to focus on this one and another one after I take you through the sequence. The acute stress response in flow and trauma. So here, Steven has this great quote in The Art of Impossible: flow starts when you say yes to the fight. So we know that flow exists in a cyclical process: struggle, release, drop into flow, and then recovery. And there's a stress response, a sympathetic response that happens in the struggle. Then there's a parasympathetic response that happens in the release, and there's a co-activation physiologically. And that's really what we're looking at here. We think that flow and trauma are opposite ends of the physiological and neurobiological spectrum. And that's why we're using this motorcycle experiment to sort of investigate whether that's true or not, empirically and theoretically. And so flow starts when you say yes to the fight. You approach, right? Then T plus 7 happens. Action plan selection, to swerve or not to swerve. What motor action needs to be done to either make this more likely into a flow state and less likely into a trauma state or PTSD. The brain then drops into flow. The flow state has been reached. And I'll explain a little bit about how that happens in a couple seconds. And then the brain says bye-bye to itself. Localized hypofrontality. There's a part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex which is involved in the self and our notion of the self, the medial prefrontal cortex, that sorts to attenuate and downregulate its activity. This is localized because we used to think that, large swaths of the prefrontal cortex would just shut down. Now we know it's much more nuanced, and largely because of this paper. It's the way and that's what I mean by, again, neurodynamical processes that I was talking about earlier. That just means the way different brain areas sort of dynamically talk to one another and communicate and order and flexibly switch which brain areas are talking to which in order to be able to meet the demands of the environment, right? And achieve goals and drop into a flow state. That's what we mean by neurodynamics or neurodynamical processes. And the way the brain does this is through oscillation. We know them as brain waves: alpha, beta, gamma. Those are the sort of the syntax of the brain, the language of the brain that it uses to communicate and be able to flexibly maneuver and switch these dynamical processes that subserve all of cognition and possibly consciousness. So I want to focus on two things: this fight or flight response. Flow says yes. Flow starts when we say yes to the fight, and the onset of flow. And so here we're talking about the flow versus trauma question. And so really it's approach versus avoidance. Why does one motorcyclist experience flow and another trauma or traumatic stress? We argue, and this is a direct quote from our paper, that the transition into flow is likely associated with the proactive willingness to approach, and the transition into trauma is likely associated with the reactive inclination to avoid. So the courage, the fortitude to fight that and go through that stress response, or the fear to back it off, to create fear memories versus fear extinction. And this is sort of how this mechanism happens neurobiologically. The brain gets a threat, the amygdala processes it, it sends it to other areas of the brain in order to be able to know what to do, increase the heart rate, the respiratory rate, all of these kinds of things. And it's mediated by top-down processing of the prefrontal cortex. Approach, so release your horses. So this is actually from the title of this paper that we reviewed in our paper. You've heard the phrase, hold your horses. Well, there's another part of the brain, the subthalamic nucleus, which is a subcortical structure, so that's deep inside the brain, that projects to and connects with this very important part of the brain, which we hypothesize is central to the brain dropping into flow versus trauma, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And this is a direct quote from our paper. Increases, so this connection, the subthalamic nucleus to the DACC, increases impulsive behavior during high conflict decision-making, while an opposing proactive inhibition response, in this case braking, you can imagine the motorcyclist braking rather than just hitting the gas and swerving in the motorcyclist scenario, hinders performance in high-risk situations that demand an immediate motor response. So this might be one reason, if this connection is activated, why we can release our horses, so to speak, get into flow versus trauma, and how the brain might actually find the flow state. The other thing to mention is when the brain actually transitions into a flow, we hypothesize, and this is testable, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a certain neuromarker called the P300 signal that is associated with this brain's dropping into the flow state and transitioning into the flow state, a series of these signals. This signals back to the error signaling. We get this neuromarker, it's very well studied, when the brain gets a surprise stimulus or an unexpected stimulus, okay? It's called the P300 signal. It's very well studied. It changes with age, with certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia or anxiety or PTSD. There's very clear signatures that is associated with that. But this is a surprise signal. And so you can imagine the motorcyclist is, oh my God, I have to swerve. Oh no, oh my God, I have to counter swerve. I have to check for me. Oh my God, I'm still alive. You can imagine the motorcyclist like a complete surprise of the situation. And the series of these P300 signals we hypothesize are associated with the brain's ability to actually find that flow state based on the flow triggers being present, of course. And so the brain transitioning into flow is really a matter of cognitive control. And I just want to define that for you now. John, am I good on time? I want to leave.
It's 10 to the hour now.
Okay, let me just really quickly sum up here. So the brain networks change their dynamical patterns to meet the task at hand. And that means to solve problems, as I said, to achieve goals, retrieve information from memory, inhibit inappropriate behavioral responses. And you could think of flow, oops, sorry about that, as a difficult to reach state, right? Like the car going from first gear to sixth gear. The brain has to go through these stages and communications with one another brain areas in order to be able to reach that difficult to reach state. And it's difficult to reach because it's very energetically demanding. It's efficient, but it's energetically demanding. And so the one bit of evidence that we think supports this is that people with PTSD cannot actually recruit brain areas associated with cognitive control. And when they do learn to recruit those areas, they actually show much reduced PTSD symptoms. And so taking this back to the very end, putting this in a broad theoretical framework, psychedelic state flow and trauma, the point that I want to take home here from this paper is that there are similarities between these states, but there are very distinct points of departure and distinctions between these states. And that helps us understand how flow actually happens and how the brain finds the flow state. In psychedelics, it's called the rebus model, the relaxed belief under psychedelics. The brain relaxes its prior beliefs, its narratives about itself, it loosens them up a little bit. and it explored the space of possible connections that brain areas talk to one another is huge, right? And this is why it probably can help with things like depression, PTSD, and so on. In flow, there's a matter of cognitive control. The brain has many boundaries, right? Whereas in psychedelics, there's few boundaries. It's constrained, it's locked in some areas, but loose enough to allow creativity and reward that's associated with flow. And in trauma, you have a state of hypervigilance. The brain is very constrained with overactive attention, paying attention to environmental cues, which actually may be threatening, right? Like, oh my God, I need to be scared with that, when you actually don't need to be scared with that kind of thing. This is from Richard Huskey's paper, who, as I mentioned, is on our paper. This might look like sort of a topological map of a brain network that that synchronizes cognitive control with reward. And this is what the sort of the network looks like in flow. And he visualized it within the brain, but also a network kind of space. So I'm going to stop there. That was, again, rapid fire. I appreciate you all listening. And yeah, thanks for your time. And I'll be happy to take questions now or async. So I'm hoping I left 7 minutes for time.
Yeah,
and Steven,
you
if you want to jump in. Yeah, good, great, awesome. Hopefully that made sense.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll keep a kind of a minute or two at the end for announcements, but so we've got some time for questions here. Wendy, your hand's up.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Michael. It immediately made me want to connect you up with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Because what we're really saying is, how do you nurture the optimal conditions for states of flow? So I think your work's really interesting, but as I say, I immediately want to go back and say, well, there's the link, because they're looking at trauma in early childhood and what the implications are for the brain. And then how do we create conditions where for all of us, we optimize the conditions for flourishing? So yeah, that's kind of where I went in my head with it.
I have a lot to say about that. Thank you. I'd love to be connected. That's great. Developmental cognitive neuroscience is especially in the context of overcoming trauma and what that means for the brain to be able to likely get into flow and use that actually to mitigate PTSD symptoms, and looking at what's happening over the lifespan, right? Early lifespan is a very interesting question. So we'd love to talk to you. Steven, if you want to jump in, cut me off. But yeah, thank you so much, Wendy, for that comment.
Yeah, Wendy, the only thing I want to add, Michael didn't have time to talk about it, but there's a tremendous amount of overlap between post-traumatic growth and flow. So most of the conditions of post-traumatic growth are actually flow-based conditions, and we're probably looking at the same kind of experience. So the tie-ins are really thick there and interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Nicoletta, I'm going to invite you to ask your question now as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Fantastic experience. Actually, your presentation made me think to the writings of Desert Favors, where you learn how to experience flow continuously, and that's it. It's really a brain exercise. It's the brain muscles that it's working to. We can discuss later about this if you are interested in to see how Desert Favors and already in the 2 and 3rd century. Mention these conditions, how to enter in the flow. But my question now, it's exactly related also to the previous comment, is about how much plays have the learning process. Imagine in the skill level, because for your hypothetical example, a more skilled motorcyclist, we will not say he's going on the floor. He's just his experience, and the flow, if you want, it's kind of already automatic. It is already there, while somebody who is less skilled has more chances to go into PTSD. So in this sense, I wouldn't say it's even a question of brain or anything. It's also the experience that you have before that. So learning before and learning after, that I would be very interested to know exactly how modifies the brain this if you found actually concretely the very modification that say, oh, the next time we will go more in the flow, then we will go, because you put it like 2 poles. I like it, that idea. So what are the conditions that next time we'll go more towards the flow than towards the trauma? Thank you.
Yeah, Nicola, that's a great question. And I'll just comment that, like, if you can imagine the challenge skills, like that John showed, the ratio, right? Experience fluctuation model talks about high skill and high challenge, right? You're here over frustration, you're low skill, but you can imagine if the perceived challenge is too great, what's above frustration? Not only anxiety, but possibly trauma, right? Possibly PTSD. Frustration can lead into that. And that's a very possibility. That's exactly what we're saying. So great point there. And the locus coeruleus norepinephrine is possibly why flow accelerates learning. We know that if you stimulate the vagus nerve, you can actually increase language learning by stimulating the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. And so that's cognitive enhancement. So that's a really good mechanism, neurobiological mechanism of why flow actually can enhance learning. So two great points. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's we did think about that, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your question, Nicola. There's loads of questions in the chat, but just to make sure we get through everything in the time of this hour, because I know that many of you, if not all of you, might have to jump on the hour, and then Michael does in particular. I'm just going to make sure we get through the announcements for today before we do anything else. So the next meeting of Flourishing Programs Flourishing Network is being chaired by our senior fellows. They're all on this call. I wonder if any of them would like just to say about that very briefly about what the next call is going to be on. Noemi or anyone else. I'm just looking at people I see on my screen right now.
I think Christine would like to chime in.
Yeah, Christine's here. There you go. There you are. You're putting on my screen now, Christine. Please go for it.
Thank you. Just very quickly, some of you received an email if you are a working group chair. So if you can respond, if you haven't already, that would be great. But that's going to be next month. We're going to have breakout rooms based on our different working groups, and we're collecting working group chairs' ideas now as to what they want to do, so we can have a little bit more of a discussion with the senior fellows and the working chairs, and then we will have more of an update for you in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Christine. And yeah, Christine's been in touch with the working group chairs, and there'll be more info to come on that soon. Also, I'll draw your attention in the chat here. I'll share a link to a forthcoming event that the Flourishing Network are hosting on entrepreneurship and flourishing in April in person at Harvard. That's being led by Christina Hinton, who co-leads the Flourishing Network with Matt and myself. Link to her in the chat there. Any questions about that, please get in touch with her. And also want to share, in connection with the theme of flourishing and flow, that Nick Holton and I have today released second episode of a two-part series on flourishing and flow in our podcast, Flourish FM, which is kindly sponsored by the Human Flourishing Program and the Department of Education at Oxford. I think those are all the announcements. Matt, is there anything other announcements today?
That sounds right to me. Thanks.
That sounds right. Okay. Everything else in the email. If you do have any more questions, I've got them on the chat here. I will send them over to Michael and Steven. If you've got to jump now, please do. Michael, do you want to say
I could put my email in the chat, actually, because I'd love to, if anybody wants to talk about collaboration or ask some more questions that can drive the research, I'm very happy to have those discussions. So let me put my email in the chat now.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael.
And
there's some other links and events have been shared in there as well. Otherwise, Matt, anything else today, or should we adjourn today's session?
Just gratitude for everyone who presented, John for hosting, and everyone for showing up.
Yes, thank you so much to Glenn, to Michael, to Steven, to all of you for coming. We can have a one-word checkout. I don't think we ever do a one-word checkout here, everyone, but let's try that. We've never done that before. It's a one-word checkout. What's your state of mind leaving here? One word, if you can drop it in before you leave. Or two words, thank you. That's nice. Flow, awesome. Flowy, fantastic. Gratitude. I'm going to put great in there too. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Matthew. Very excited, Gilda. Thank you. Intrigued, Mandy. Awesome. Inspired, Lisa. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Steven, for coming and inspiring this research. Just wanted to say that publicly. So really good stuff. Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.